First of all, ask Professor Luigi Ambrosio, Director of the Scuola Normale Superiore, to kindly provide his opening address. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvio. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I am glad to open today's workshop on Ukraine and Russia, political, economic, and social change over the war, organized by the Istituto Ciampi of the Scuola Normale Superiore and by our unit, by the local unit in the Scuola of the Scholars at Risk Network. In 2022, the Scuola Normale Superiore offered research positions to two scholars, Andrey Maliuk from Ukraine and Oleg Zubralev from Russia, who in the context of the war, of course, could not have pursued their research activities in their countries. And indeed, we are proud to have them working now in the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences in Florence. And actually, this event is built really around their studies, their international networks, and on the research carried out by many of our colleagues and PhD students. The Istituto Ciampi of the Scuola has already organized an international conference in May of this year. The title was In the Shade of a Collapse, Imperial Legacies, Failed Democratization, Civil Society and Nationalism in the Post-Soviet Space. This was organized by Silvio, who is the organizer also today, and by Donatella Della Porta. In that time, the focus was on historical processes and political structures in that area, offering a kind of long-term perspective on the roots and the context of the war. Today's workshop, on the other hand, is complementary to that event, but is looking at the present development, at the political, economic, and social changes that have emerged during the war in these two countries. And of course, we hope that this kind of analysis will bring attention to the present and future of Ukraine and Russia beyond the emphasis on daily emphasis, let me say like that, on the war fighting. And we hope that a better understanding of the complex social and political processes in these countries may help all of us to open the doors to the end of the conflict and to a reconstruction of these societies in the best possible way. Actually, in 2024, the Istituto Ciampi will continue this line of research. We have already planned a long-term planning, and the Istituto will continue to debate with another international conference on related issues. And I hope that the Scuola Normale will continue to be a kind of international point of reference for studies in these and related areas. And of course, I wish you a successful and useful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Luigi. So let's start our first session. The title of the session is Political and Economic Change Over the War. First speaker, Alexander Baunov of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the European University Institute. He will speak on Russian politics over the war. Let me ask the speakers to maintain their interventions within the 15 minutes, so we do preserve some space for discussion. Please, Alexander.
I just make several constatations that may seem unpleasant, but unfortunately that's the moment where we are. As you know, 2 days ago, Vladimir Putin announced his candidacy for a 5th term, not to mention the term he was a prime minister. in a frame, it was staged in a typical authoritarian show with doubts and demands from the different sort of people, different categories of people surrounding him and asking him not to leave the country in the difficult moment. But the scientists, the pollsters, even the independent ones from Levada Center, which is the only one independent sociological service active in Russia, confirmed that around 80, even a bit more percent of the Russian population want to see him as a next president. This number would have been different without the war. It would be around 50%. So the fact is that the war made Russian leader, Russian dictator more popular. There are several other goals Vladimir Putin and Russian regime have achieved, not from the quick victory as they expected, but there are some advantages they gained from the prolonged, protracted war. The separation of Russian elite from the West. It was an ongoing effort by Vladimir Putin for many years. He tried to attach the Russian, first of all, economic elite to the motherland. That means the Russian power, to the regime. The elite that it was largely formed during the period of relative openness in 90s and the beginning of this century, not very successfully. Now the war and the sanctions helped him to sever the ties of the Russian elite with the West, which otherwise would have been impossible. The issue of the conservation of the regime and of the legacy of the current Russian leader. In Putin's circles, there has always been a fear of a second perestroika, sort of newcomers, next generation, naive leadership that can be seduced by the West and overturn, reject the legacy of the current regime. War, long war, a separation of the Russian nomenclature, Russian political class from the Western political class helped significantly to diminish this scenario. The removal of dissidents. It was very difficult to get rid of this part of the legacy of Russian 90s and early 2000s. One of the pillars of Russian regimes was free-minded, free-thinking intellectuals that supported Gorbachev, Yeltsin. They were largely represented in all Russian institutions, from the government to the educational institutions. Now, a big part of actively disloyal individuals have left the country. Another part have experienced a new level of repressions unknown since the late Soviet time, or even worse. So COVID, followed by the war, followed up by a new level of repressions, completely dismantled the infrastructure for the protest in Russia. Economy. Russian economy has been stagnating from around 2013 or 2014. The military keynesianism has helped Vladimir Putin to relaunch the economic growth. It is quite accurate number that for this year, Russia expects a growth of 3.5%. But what is more impressive is the 7.4% of growth in the industries. Not just in the manufacturing industries and the manufacturing sector. Only 14 of 86 Russian regions will have budget deficit this year. Before COVID, and of course before the war, there were around 50-60 regions with budget deficit in Russia. There is real growth of salaries in manufacturing sectors and real growth of incomes. Historic minimum of unemployment connected to the fact that those less qualified are now gaining when waging the war, when fighting, and the enterprises, the companies are competing for more qualified people, which is a competition of salaries, especially in the manufacturing sector. In services, restaurant and cafe sector in Moscow has grown in 20% this year, which is especially surprising. But it seems that people are overeating and overdrinking their stress connected to the war. Those who visit Moscow, I haven't been there since last year, confirm that everything is full. This example is followed by the regions. One of the tasks of both democratic and authoritarian Russian leaders was the prioritizing the manufacturing sector over the extraction of the raw materials. It seems to be done. Of course, it's a very peculiar manufacturing sector, but it provides the redistribution of the wealth from the regions that were previously wealthier, connected to the oil and gas economy, to the regions that were previously poor. Central Russia, industrial Urals, part of Siberia, south, not Caucasus, which was another long-standing goal for Russian governments, to fight this regional disparity. With the war, it seems they are achieving this goal. The infrastructural touring to the east, not to mention, BAM, Transsib, all these railways towards China, pipelines toward China are getting new massive investment. The turn towards east was declared after the first set of sanctions in 2014, but the Russian business was very reluctant to do it quickly. Now they don't have any other choice. Of course, all these economic achievements are related to the massive budget financing. But it's around 30% of the budget now. It's somehow related to the war, defense, and security. But the design of sanctions was done that way that last year Russia has received a surplus of 200 billion from the gas trade. Of course, we don't know if it continues for a long time, but now we don't. For the years to come, the opinions vary here, but from 1, 2 to 3, 4, 5 years, there won't be any serious budget problem expected. Another thing that happened, and it is in the favor of Putin's regime, it's a war of Middle East that pushed aside the war in Ukraine in the news, and the fact of revival of political struggle inside Ukraine has started a fracturing the pro-Ukrainian consensus around the war. So both things, the war in the Middle East and the relaunch of political fight inside Ukraine, helped the relativization, let's say, the global relativization of the issue of the Russian aggression. Then global admissions that were always significant for the Russian regime and Putin himself. From the very beginning, Russia was trying to package its aggression as a sort of, I forgot about the slides, okay. It's a sort of global uprising. It's a sort of global revolution against the established world order. It's a Western-centric world order. The lack of success on the front has made this war against the new war, against the old world order, a number one task. Because it was only one way to explain to the Russian citizens and to the rest of the world why, with such a disparity in size of the economy, population, military machine, and so on, Russia has no significant gains, has not shown any significant victory in the front line. The explanation was provided. That's because Russia is fighting not against Ukraine. That's because Russia is fighting against a sort of global uprising. It's leading a global uprising against the world order, against the West. The West is mighty. That's why Russia has not such impressively successful as it could be expected. Surprisingly, the explanation works not only for the domestic audience, but partly for the world audience, as we see. And Putin has, and Russian war has acquired a sort of a pool of fans, a pool of supporters, if not allies, around the world. Ideology building. Russian constitution bans any state ideology. Now we see that Russian authoritarian regime is acquiring, is building a very peculiar sort of ideology. Yes, Russia is leading the anti-Western, anti-globalist uprising and its all eyes, but inside the country, it's a sort of revolution similar to what Francisco Franco led in Spain. It's nationalist, conservative revolution against anything liberal, against LGBT, against the West. And the war is helping to bypass this lack of ideology and to build a very state-centric ideology. If we are trying to define the ideology the Russian regime is building now, it's the extreme form of the cult of the state. The state is highest value. Any ruler has better than any disloyal or any critic of any regime in Russian history. Any Russian period, in any period in Russian history is great. Any Russian ruler is eventually great. Any critic of the regime or of the power is unpatriotic. Even the notion of the closeness of special ties or even the unity of Russians and Ukrainians have been confirmed recently by the success of a series appeared in Russia and dedicated to the life of the youngster gangs in the late Soviet Tatarstan, late Soviet Kazakhs, that right now, these particular days, has been largely watched by both Russians and Ukrainians on both sides of the front line, which is a paradox of the second year of the bloody war. And it somehow supports the Putin's point that, we are talking about the same people, same civilization, same cultural space, and so on. Of course, it doesn't support any conclusion he's drawing from this fact. At the beginning of the war, I was writing that there's some part of Russian nation, some part of Russian citizens, the bearer of resentment, anti-Western feeling, nostalgic of the greatness of the past, who are ready to sacrifice their prosperity or their stability, at least partly sacrifice them, for the achievement of the great goal, this new greatness, new importance. We are now in the situation that the supporters of this resentment are not giving up anything. They are not sacrificing anything. And this is a moment when political and personal choices based on values, ethics, and principles seems to be losing ground. It's very sad, but something has to be done about this.
Thank you, Alexander. So next speaker will be Volodymyr Ishchenko, Freie Universität. Title of the paper is Class or Regional Cleavage, the Russian Invasion and Ukraine's East-West Divide.
Yeah, it works. So yeah, great. Thank you for inviting me again here. This is a presentation of actually an article that has already been published, but I haven't had an occasion to present it yet. So I beg your pardon in advance if I may need a little bit more than 15 minutes, because it's kind of like an experiment, but it's actually, it continues some of the issues that Alexander was talking about some of the paradoxes that we observe in the middle of the war, when supposedly the war which presents an existential threats, and simultaneously we see some of the recurring similarities between Russian and Ukrainians, and this brings the question of to discuss the Ukrainian diversity, which have been one of the, I would say, one of the most important issues behind this war. So for a very long period of time in post-Soviet Ukrainian politics was dominated by this political cleavage. This could be discussed as pro-Western or pro-Russian or Eastern or Western. I actually just prefer to call it Eastern or Western political camps in Ukraine. And there is, in fact, a very big discussion in the studies of Ukraine. What exactly this cleavage, where exactly this cleavage is coming from? And what is character, what is nature, and what actually has happened with it after the invasion. So there is one camp where actually there are quite many diverse scholars who would argue that there is something like two Ukraines. And this cleavage that we've observed in Ukrainian politics on most of the elections between the mid of 1990s until at least 2019, when Zelensky was elected, and I would say even until the invasion, and this cleavage may actually reappear once again, it may be interpreted as a kind of like, some people interpret it as almost like exactly like an ethno-linguistic conflict and its political representation. Other people would say something that the eastern and western regions in Ukraine had quite divergent political cultures, and this goes back into the history of the Russian Empire, which controlled most of Ukrainian territory, and the Habsburg Empire, which controlled the westernmost part of Ukraine, and it had a very endurable legacy. Some other scholars, intellectuals, actually quite patriotic, they would say something about the conflict of nation-building projects, pro-Western nation-building projects against pro-Russian or pro-Soviet nation-building project. But what is the common basis of all these approaches? That basically both the eastern and western sides of the cleavage are understood as variations within the same category, either ethnic conflict or regional cultures conflict, and they are understood as largely symmetrical in their strength, symmetrical in the character of both sides. There is a different approach which has become somewhat more popular, especially because of inflation, and in particular because of the political reasons, because these two Ukraines are so much instrumentalized in Russian narratives. These scholars, they claim that this East-West cleavage does not reflect and does not represent any stable or clearly defined regions in Ukraine or any ethno-national cultural conflicts within the Ukrainian society. Perhaps Galicia is an actual region which had some history behind it because it was the only region which was controlled by the Habsburg Empire. Perhaps Donbass is a particular region. But what's between them? Most of Ukraine. Are there any regions exist, like let's say in Germany or even in Italy? And they argue that this political cleavage basically conceals a much more complex and dynamic diversity on the ground. And it's basically merely a social construction which is instrumentalized in the interest of competing elite groups in Ukraine and also by Kremlin. So the cleavage exists only on political level. It does not really have a social ground behind it. And finally, there's a complementary argument that in the service the scholars, at least they claiming that we would see the rise of Ukrainian civic identity that encompasses all of the parts of Ukraine that have been amplified by the revolutions in 2004 and 2014, and also by the threat from Russia. And so now most of Ukrainians are consolidated around this civic identity, and this East-West cleavage is basically history, even if it existed ever before. Yeah, this is like one of the examples that they would typically claim. There is a very quite known book by Olga Onuch and Henry Hell, which was published last year, the Zelensky Effect, which basically builds this argument. Zelensky united the Ukraine, so only the westernmost or easternmost parts of Ukraine voted for more pro-Western or pro-Russian politicians. And especially after the invasion, they would show you like tons of different surveys data, how Ukrainians became much more pro-NATO, much more pro-EU, much more pro-Ukraine, much more Ukrainian language speaking, and so on and so forth. So basically, everything have consolidated. Ukraine is now kind of like the nation that they would actually prefer to see. And in effect, they would construct an argument over not basically of 22 Ukraines, but of just one Ukraine, a teleological nation-building argument that one Ukraine that have finally won. And everything that was connected to the Eastern camp was basically something like thrown to the dustbin of history. It's very important to understand how prominent this thinking about Ukraine, East and West were for Putin's thinking. So this is a quotation from October 21, interaction at Valdai lecture talk, when a Ukrainian pundit asked him a question, what are you going to do when your biggest ally, Viktor Medvedchuk, is under arrest and persecuted, his TV stations are closed, and I mean, Ukraine is turning into anti-Russia, it's going to join NATO, and so on and so forth. And Putin responds. So there is some big problem with this country. The leaders, so the population elects pro-Russian leaders, but then they come to power and they immediately change their political positions into the opposite. But why? Because the silent majority in Ukraine is overridden by aggressive nationalist minority. So, and this is a deadlock. And he didn't know what to do, but this was discussed just 4 months before the invasion. So in his thinking, this East-West is reproduced, but this is also combined with the articulating a fundamental asymmetry between the two camps. So one camp is much more politically capable, another camp has some severe deficiency. And even if it could be much more popular, it just incapable to pursue the political gains. And the actual fact of the Russian invasion poses two big puzzles, I would say, for both interpretations of the Ukrainian political cleavage. So the Kremlin could not secure its interest in Ukraine by relying on a soft power, on the political mobilization of the supposedly pro-Russian camp. What does it mean, right? So one interpretation would be that that Eastern camp was not necessarily pro-Russian at all, but then it requires an explanation. What exactly the Eastern camp was standing for, if not pro-Russianness? How those 22 Ukrainians on the ground, diverse and fluid diversity, was translated in just 2 Ukrainians on the political level, with all the ethnicized and geopoliticized interpretations. How does it happen? And the people who argue for 22 Ukrainians actually do not have an explanation for that. On the other hand, the problem for the 2 Ukrainians is actually the Eastern and Western camps were dramatically asymmetrical in their political capacity. But why? If this is supposedly the conflict of the same categories, or the variations of the same category. The second puzzle is that the decision by the Kremlin, Putin, very, very close circle of those who made the decision, to rely on the hard power of the invasion was based on a plan of a very quick special operation to be finished in a very limited time with tolerable economic and political costs. So the problem is that on the first stage of the invasion, the collaboration of the Eastern camp was rather an exception. I mean, not exceptional, that like extraordinary, but like limited, minimal. And this, of course, produced a lot of the interpretations that Russia just completely did not understand Ukraine at all. They expected that everyone would welcome them with the flowers, how stupid they were. FSB is just incompetent idiots. They did not know what happens in Ukraine. The problem with, and of course this would contribute to the argument of the 22 Ukrainians. The problem is that actually, if you look at the most careful analysis of what happened on the very first days of the invasion and why that original plan to take the airport near Kiev, to take the governmental quarters in Kiev, to decapitate the Ukrainian government, it was not a bet on the weakness of decentralized resistance of Ukrainian citizens, or on the massive collaboration of Ukrainian citizens with the invasion. This was a bet on the capacity to rapidly decapitate and destabilize the centralized resistance in Ukraine, to remove or at least arrest, remove, murder Zelensky, or the chief person in Ukraine, and then the whole structure of Ukrainian military institution would just disintegrate. But it was not a bet on the enthusiastic welcome, or even the lack of any decentralized resistance to the Russian invaders. And it's important to remember that the Russians have successfully consolidated control in the southern regions, which are until now they are occupied by Russia, not by the collaboration, not by the lack of resistance which actually exists there, but by the escalation of the repression. And so this brings the final puzzle, that Ukraine's consolidation, to the extent it actually occurred, was not a cause, but an outcome of the failure of the original invasion plan. And it's important to underline that it's not an outcome of the invasion itself, but the failure of the invasion on the very first days of it. And so in the last minutes, I don't know how much I do actually have, that's an attempt to present an alternative interpretation of the whole East-West political cleavage that has consequences of what we should expect also in the course of the invasion. So basically like 4 arguments. So first of all, there is a social conflict behind Ukraine's political polarization. This conflict actually is not simply about Ukraine. It cuts across the whole post-Soviet space. It is class-based, and this class asymmetry explains why it was profoundly asymmetrical on the political level as well. And I will try to, very briefly, to substantiate these main claims. Why post-Soviet? Why not simply Ukrainian? We need to look at the transgressive politics, not simply conventional politics of other countries. We would see in the major episodes of the most massive protests and revolutions in Russia, in Armenia, in Belarus, largely the same opposition, so between the personalistic autocrats, typically linked to the oligarchic cronies, the middle class civil societies, often allied with dissenting elements within the elites. They sometimes benefit from the revolution's success. These conflicts in other countries, they are typically articulated as a struggle for democracy and against corruption, but they are also often framed geopolitically as a pro-Western choice. And we would see this not only in the countries like Moldova, which have kind of like similar cleavages with ethnic dimension, and so that could be interpreted as a kind of like post-colonial legacy of Russian subjugation or something like that. But we would also see this in the mono-ethnic countries consolidated by post-genocidal identities such as Armenia, which has a different history behind it, but largely similar histories of the post-Soviet revolution in 2018, and crucially within Russia itself. Class conflict. So basically this interpretation comes from analysis of so-called political capitalism, where I draw a lot on Ivan Selenin, Branko Milanovic, and understanding this as a ruling class in the post-Soviet countries, which started to dominate the economies in the process of centrifugal disintegration after the collapse of the Soviet Union, taking the commanding heights of the economy. And the major competitive advantage are selective benefits from the state. The material nature of this class and where their competitive advantages are coming from, they structure the main lines of conflict. So between the fractions of the political capitalists, and this conflict is poorly institutionalized, with the transnational capital, which would benefit from more so-called transparency that would allow bigger profits after, and actually the realization of investment. The local political capitalists would actually benefit from lack of transparency, because this is their main advantage. And with the professional middle classes, who, because of their underinvestment, which is also coming from the political capitalist nature of the ruling class, the main opportunity for their advancement, both economically, politically, and culturally, lies in the integration with the West. And these lines of largely zero-sum conflict, they coalesce in the class conflict of political capitalists on the one side and against professional middle classes allied with transnational capital. Sometimes they are opportunistically joined by dissenting groups of political capitalists. This conflict is articulated around the claims against corruption and for democracy. And basically, these are the claims against the illegitimate exploitation of public resources in the interest of a narrow group of people who usurp state power for this purpose. And finally, asymmetry, where this political asymmetry, the crucial thing, comes from. And you would see this kind of like rough typization of the Western and Eastern camps in Ukraine. The ideological asymmetry. One camp can promise some Western integration away from Moscow, which in this case, it's partially delusional, because the offer of NATO and EU integration is, I mean, you can observe what happens with the EU talks this week. Partially, it's also damaging to large sections of the working classes. But at the same time, this is at least an offer of some development. The other side was not actually offering any pro-Russian development. It was offering stagnation, stability. And this was actually the main attractive points of that. But this is very much deficient. The asymmetry of the civil society, NGOs, universities, intellectuals, largely in the Western camp. The Eastern camp was deriving its political power, if you can call it, from TV and pundits. Both camps had radical wings, but radical nationalists were actually on the rise. The communist left was in decline all the post-Soviet years, more or less. The middle-class professionals, those who actually are capable for articulating forward-looking ideologies, for civic mobilization, are much stronger represented in the Western camp. And it also has an implication for the protest mobilization, much stronger in the Western camp than in the Eastern camp, and for the capacity for the Western camp to actually lead the post-Soviet revolutions in Ukraine. And coming to the conclusions, the constitutions were actually one of the main questions in the debate about the Eastern and Western Ukraine. The constitution of the East-West ethnicized and geopoliticized polarization was basically the mobilization of the threats in the context when both camps were not capable to offer the forward-looking projects, or at least their forward-looking projects were very much limited, let's say in the Western camp. This asymmetrical capacity to universalize their particular interests and sustain them with the civic mobilization was an outcome of the asymmetric class coalitions behind the Eastern and Western camps. The original invasion plan was a bet on the real destabilization trends in the Ukrainian politics on the eve of the invasion, and Zelensky was actually entering into a lot of squabbles and fights with almost all of the major groups in the Ukrainian politics, not only with the pro-Russian groups, but also with the pro-Western opposition, also with the most wealthiest oligarch in Ukraine, Rinat Akhmetov, whom Zelensky accused in the preparation of a coup d'etat against him just 2 months before the Russians invaded. So there were destabilization trends, and this was much more important than a misperception of the weak base of the Russians of power. And Ukraine's tentative anti-Russian consolidation was as an outcome of the immediate opportunistic responses of the majority of the Eastern camp supporters, rather than anything of identity conversion. And this explains all this, why those people are still watching the Russian TV series, why we would see another escalation of the inter-elite fight in Ukraine between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. Consolidation was rather fragile, and why we might see in the end, and we actually start to see now, the reversal of those consolidation trends that we have been so much prominent in 2022. It's a lot depends on the outcome of the war and the expectations about Ukraine's victory. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Third speaker will be Andrey Maliuk, of Scuola Normale Superiore, the political economy of Ukraine. Please, Andrey.
No. Is it? No. World system political economy of the contemporary Ukrainian crisis should be considered in the context of the crisis of global capitalism. At the turn of 1970s, world capitalism began to enter a systemic crisis. The situation of our accumulation of capital, our capacity and overproduction relative to demand emerged. The response to the fall in profitability of investment in production was doubtful. On the one hand, the flow of capital into financial sphere, the so-called financialization, and on the other hand, the transfer of the lower floors of industrial production to the periphery of world capitalism. All this was impossible without the destruction of the Soviet Union and the system of societies of real socialism. It was in the historical context of this conjuncture that the integration of the post-Soviet space, including Ukraine, into the global capitalist economy took place through neoliberal market reforms. In the midst of triumphalism of the end of history, a euphoria emerged that the transition to capitalism through neoliberal market reforms would bring to unprecedented economic growth and democracy to the post-Soviet countries. But only one small group of rich capitalist countries was pointed as a model of market economy. And there was illusion that having abandoned socialism, Ukraine would integrate into a community of Western countries. That is, it would join to the group of rich states. The matter is that the world capitalist system, as an organic whole, has dual structure consisting of developed center and underdeveloped periphery, convincing the public that the establishment of the systemic dominance of market economy, that its system of private enterprises connected only through market will allow reaching the level of development of rich countries, neoliberals actually organize the transition to peripheral capitalism. Buying Ukraine led to the destruction of its social economic potential, huge demographic losses, a 32% drop in GDP, an investment collapse, a huge drop in industrial production by 40% in 2022, and a sharp increase in inflation. But even before the war, Ukraine, as a result of neoliberal reforms, has experienced economic decline and declining living standards for the labor majority of the population. Ukraine's economic trajectory in the post-Soviet period was one of the generating backwardness. As a result, a peripheral capitalism-type society was built in Ukraine. Usually, such countries experience transformation in their productive potential that makes their economic structure more primitive. As a result, they specialize in the labor-intensive production of several raw materials and low-processed products supplied to developed countries. Instead of realizing inherited Soviet scientific and industrial potential, Ukraine has turned into a poor country with a deindustrialized economy, degraded infrastructure, and degenerating social services and social welfare institutions. It should be noted the sharp decline in the country's GDP. Having lost 60% of GDP by 1999, Ukraine was never able to restore its 1990 level. In 2019, its GDP was 65% of the 1990 level. In 1992, the share of Ukraine in global GDP was approximately 1%. That is, 1% of the world economy was accounted for Ukraine. In 30 years, its share of global GDP was 0.4% in 2021. Ukraine has become a poor country with a very low GDP per capita. In terms of GDP per capita, in 2020, Ukraine occupied one of the last places among European countries and 103rd place in the world. Capitalist transformation of the Ukrainian economy and society was accompanied by a catastrophic decline in industrial production. The structure of industrial production changed towards an increase in the share of labor, energy, and material-intensive industries, and decrease in the output of high-tech final products. All these years, Ukrainian economy, losing its scientific and technological potential, was sliding to the primitive level of raw material appendage of the world economic system. The situation of the machine building industry is quite indicative in this respect. The share of mechanical engineering in the structure of Ukraine's industry fell from 31% in 1990 to 11% in 2013. Is about 6% now, while the share of metallurgy increased from 13% to 24%. That is, instead of producing complex machine tools and aggregates, the production of steel semi-finished products with low added value and low quality came to the fore in the structure of industrial production. To a large extent, this was a consequence of the fact that, in accordance with neoliberal doctrine of transformation, Ukraine from the very beginning chose an export-oriented development model based on the export production of colonial goods, raw materials, low process, and agricultural products. Metallurgical products of low degree of processing, agricultural, and food industry products took the predominant positions in Ukrainian exports. According to the World Bank, share of capital-extensive exports has fallen to almost 16% in 2017 due to low investment in fixed assets. Ukrainian economy is in urgent need of modernization. Depreciation of fixed assets in industry, energy, public utilities already in pre-war period reached from 65 to 90%. That is, it exceeded the threshold indicator of economic security of 50. The pronounced deep structural degradation of its economy, which is expressed in clearly raw material and intermediate products export specialization of the Ukrainian economy in the global division of labor, is another indicator of Ukraine's peripheral status. Under conditions of degradation of the economy, the competitiveness of export industries can only be maintained due to the low price of labor, which means low wages for workers, and this in turn means massive poverty. About 60% of country's population is below the poverty level. As a result, labor migration is growing from Ukraine, which is also turning into exporter of labor. Another negative consequence of the neoliberal peripherization of Ukrainian society has been a huge increase in social inequality. According to expert estimates, the difference between incomes of the richest 10% of population and the poorest of 10% in Ukraine was at least 40 times. The growth of poverty and inequality was a direct consequence of the fact that in the process of the transformation of social and economic and property relations, a new social class structure was formed, where at one pole there is an oligarchy that seized control of the economy and political system, and at the other a class of wage labor deprived of real rights. Until 2014, the concentration of capital in Ukraine exceeds that of Russia. The total assets of 100 richest Ukrainians in 2011 amounted to 61% of the country's annual GDP. While the richest 100 Russians owned only one third of Russia's GDP. In 2013, Ukrainian oligarchs owned 40% of the country's GDP, while the combined capital of the 5 richest Ukrainians was 15% of GDP, indicating a high level of oligarchization. Only Rinat Akhmetov's fortune, which was estimated by Focus magazine at $15 billion in 2013, amounted to 8% of Ukraine's GDP at that time. In 2017, 5 Ukrainian oligarchs accounted for about 7% of GDP. This is almost as much as in Russia. The value assets of the 100 richest Ukrainians decreased to 23% of Ukraine's GDP in 2019. However, the political and economic influence of oligarchy persisted. The fall in labor income of population and the sharp increase in social inequality have had a catastrophic impact on the demographic situation in Ukraine. In 1990 to 2013, the country's population decreased from 52 million people to 46 million people. So it decreased by 12%. By 2022, Ukraine's population was already 37 million people. Now, Ukraine's population has shrunk to 32 million people as International Monetary Fund estimated. But if we deduce Crimea, the country has only 29 million. The demographic catastrophe in Ukraine turned out to be the worst among the former Soviet republics in terms of natural decline. Having lost a significant part of manufacturing industry, Ukraine became dependent on imports of industrial products from industrialized countries. Given the price scissors between imported products with high value added and exported products with low value added, there was a chronic problem of trade deficit and balance of payment deficit. Average is possible only through external borrowing. This in turn gives rise to the problem of chronic and growing external debt. The volume of gross external debt increased from $55 billion in 2006 to $130 billion in 2021, or 65% of GDP. Ukraine's external debt is 4 times higher than its gold and foreign exchange reserve. This means that Ukraine cannot survive this debt on its own and has to take out new loans to pay off old ones. Thus, as a typical peripheral country, Ukraine is entangled in a network of financial dependence and is in debt bondage from which it is unlikely to be able to extricate itself. Unable to pay its debt, Ukraine is forced to sell off national assets. This is served by programs of large-scale privatization of banks, state enterprises, and land, the market of which will be open to foreign capital. All these requirements and plans, including the introduction of strict anti-labor legislation and measures to deregulate activities of private capital, are contained in the plan for the reconstruction of Ukraine, presented at the International Conference on the Reconstruction of Ukraine, held on July 22 in Lugano. However, according to some reports, foreign capital has been quietly taking over the natural resources of the Ukraine for 3 decades. By 2022, 10 multinational agricultural corporations already controlled 3.5 million hectares of land in Ukraine. But according to the Australian National Review, published in May 2022, 17 million hectares of Ukrainian agricultural land were owned by 3 United States companies, Cargill, DuPont, and Monsanto. This is approximately equal to the area of all agricultural land in Italy. Experts have calculated that this area is approximately half of all agricultural land of Ukraine. In addition to external debt, another factor in the bleeding of the Ukrainian economy is a large-scale and systematic outflow of capital. According to the National Economic Strategy, the annual value of capital withdrawn to offshore zones is estimated at $12 billion. And in total, during the years of independence, $148 billion were withdrawn. The withdrawal of capital is another channel for the transfer of value produced in Ukraine to the industrialized country, indicating its peripheral status. At the same time, this figure is most likely underestimated, since, according to the Tax Justice Network, for the period from 1991 to 2014, $167 billion were withdrawn from Ukraine to offshore. And according to other data presented in the Global Financial Integrity Study, in just 10 years, from 2004 to 2013, $116 billion were exported from Ukraine to offshore jurisdictions. But 10 years have passed since then. In any case, the amount of capital exported far exceeds the country's sovereign debt and approaches the value of its annual GDP. The reasons for the social economic degradation of Ukraine are related to the fact that the neoliberal market transformation led to the formation of social economic system dominated by personalized oligarchic private property. Its formation took place in the process of privatization state-owned enterprises that were part of single economic complex. Privatization, by tearing out pieces of production assets from this complex, destroyed and naturally led to the disruption of value chains that is destructive for the modern industrial productive forces. The Ukrainian economy was monopolized by a group of mainly raw material export-oriented oligarchs. The consolidation of such social economic system became the source of the development of underdevelopment. Well, at present, the further trajectory of Ukraine's social economic development is hidden in the fog of war. Given all uncertainty, predicting what Ukraine's recovery will be like is sheer fantasy. However, it can be argued, based on the current economic policy of the Ukrainian government, that at present there are no prospects for changing the model of economic development of Ukraine. On the contrary, it continues to be based on neoliberal principles. It is fully consistent with the recommendations of Western economists. According to a group of economists from London-based Center for Economic Policy Research, led by Kenneth Rogoff, the war is a massive reallocation shock. Also, wartime governments usually take over the allocation of resources Ukrainian circumstances call for more market-based allocation mechanism to ensure cost-effective solutions that do not overburden the state capacity, exacerbate existing problems such as corruption, or encourage untaxed black market activities. To this end, the aim should be pursue expensive radical deregulation of economic activity. And all recommendation of Western experts is that the government should minimize regulation and other red tape that can constrain and slow down the allocation of labor, capital and materials in the economy. As Adam Tooze noted in this regard, contrary to what you might expect, namely that war would lead to a search for solidaristic social and economic measures to shore up the Ukrainian home front, the Center for Economic Policy Research team demand radical deregulation. In this respect, they outdo the imagination of even a radical observer such as Slavoj Žižek, who fondly imagined that the war had led to a temporary retreat of neoliberal designs of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian government does not intend to retreat from neoliberal approach when during the war, adopting legislation that establishes working day exceeding 8 hours significantly worsens the situation of workers and effectively removes 80% of the country's workforce from the protection of national labor law. As Zelensky economic advisor Rodnyansky has said, we have deep issues with our labor code developed in the 1970s that needs to be overhauled. We are going to try to emulate a more liberal approach with a flexible labor market because we need to catch up. So, the war was used to promote a shock doctrine to rapidly accelerate the neoliberalization of Ukrainian society. As one Ukrainian commentator put it, Zelensky's party has pushed through laws that have effectively destroyed the right to collective bargaining, as well as other labor protections in Ukraine. It has also implemented pension law reforms built as decommunizing the social welfare system, but in fact, amounting to radical cutbacks. Both plans were drafted well before the Russian invasion, but the wartime state of emergency have greatly aided the party's ability to implement its agenda, whose anti-labor animus has even run afoul of the normally moderate International Labour Organization. Instead of labor rights and social welfare, Zelensky and his advisor promote smartphone ports, a joint venture with Amazon, and other public-private partnerships. In effect, they see post-war Ukraine as a gigantic spatial economic zone on the fringe of Europe, where weak labor protections and lack tariff barriers will incentivize investment from European multinationals. So also Ukrainian oligarchs will have to make room and moderate their ambitions. The trend of neoliberal marketization continues in Ukraine, which will allow Western capital to strengthen control over national wills of Ukraine and its labor resources. This means that peripheral decay of Ukrainian society will continue.
Thank you. So we have 20 minutes left for discussion, but first of all, let me ask our discussants to provide their comments, possibly 5-6 minutes. Guglielmo Meardi, Scuola Normale Superiore, and Annalisa Rosselli, Accademia nazionale dei Lincei.
I need a microphone. I think it's better for everybody. So thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting workshop. I'm learning a lot, and thank you also for inviting me to participate in this commendable initiative of scholars at risk, which I cannot but totally approve of. So what can I say about the many things that we heard? I have a comment and a few questions. The comment, you will forgive me, but comes from my experience and background of historian of economic thought. You will be surprised by hearing that what I heard brought me back to a very old debate that goes back to the years, to the early years of political economy, a debate between two giants of Western economic thought that were David Hume and Adam Smith. And they both were opposed to the war that Britain then was waging against France, mainly over the control of colonies in North America. They both thought that these wars were ruinous for the people of Britain, but they disagreed on the causes of the war. And David Hume maintained that the cause was passion, was a desire to dominate the rest of Europe. And in this sense, it was the economic power subordinate to military power, functional to military power, as it was, as it had been in the past. For Adam Smith, on the contrary, it was not passion, but interest. The interest of a specific class, the class of merchants, the class of capitalists, we would say now, and the class that wanted, that aimed at the huge profits of external trade, of colonial trade. Who was right then? Smith, of course, thought that military power was subordinate to economic power, should serve to increase, to open markets and so on. But at the same time, Smith and other great scholars of the Enlightenment thought that the interest is something which is easier to control than passions. And so if we follow interest, sooner or later, we all be convinced that wars are useless because there are other ways of enrichment. Trade, above all, is one of them. And I think that Smith prevailed, and we Europeans, above all after World War II, became Smithian in this sense, convinced that wars were impossible because there were so many links between nations, between countries. And this is why also the Russian aggression came as a shock. We did not expect it, and not just because were not following the politics or geopolitics, but because it sounded to everyone like a relic of the past, a war for controlling a piece of land. A piece of land, Shakespeare would have said, so small that could not contain the graves of all the people who had to die for it. Anyway, was just a comment. But going back to the papers, above all, Maliuk paper, because this is the one which is closer to my interest of economist. If I understand your reconstruction, you argue that Ukraine had a developed industrial sector that had all the prerequisite to be further developed and modernized. But the neoliberal reforms were imposed too early, and sounds familiar to Italians, this story. And this led to backwardness instead of progress. And now Ukraine is a country export-led, which exports just iron, grain, and capitals, and labor. So I do not dispute the data that you provide. I must say that I'm a bit puzzled by reading that 40% of GDP was investment in productive capacity. Well, it's striking because, say, at its peak, investment in Western countries, 25, 27%, 40% is a huge data. And I do not dispute also what you say about the state of the Ukrainian industry, although I thought that in the Soviet division of labor among countries, it was the DDR which was the most advanced in technological terms, but I know nothing of this, so it was just I am conveying to you what was, say, conventional wisdom here in Italy. And I do not dispute that, unfortunately, the Soviet Union collapsed at the peak of the wave of neoliberalism, or what how many minutes I have? 2 minutes? Of what was defined by Albert Hirschman, the great development economist, the typical rebound effect. What is the rebound effect? Well, somebody says all economic policies should have a sell-by date. So we should learn to adapt and adjust policies to given circumstances, and not be convinced that what once works always and works everywhere. And this is a great lesson from the past, but as somebody said, history is a good teacher, unfortunately has very few pupils. So I think that this is what happened to Keynesian policies when we had the crisis of the 70s. There are many other factors besides those that you mentioned: Bretton Woods collapse, there was the labor unrest, there were the oil shocks, but there was a crisis which required new policies, as all the policies were still carried on, and this provoked a rebound. Not do new things, but undo old things. So what you say, in a sense, I more or less share your reconstruction, but I have a couple of questions. One is that you seem to think that Ukraine was already such a dangerous competitor for the West that had to be, say, its industrial structure had to be eliminated. Well, it isn't thought that, as we heard, that this is not the main cause of the economic choices after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Was not much more a conflict of power relations that existed in Ukrainian society. So privatizations were done in the worst possible way. Was not an excellent example, as we heard right now, of this crony political capitalism that manifested itself also in Soviet Union. A second question, and I have just two. One, you seem to identify the fact that Ukrainian is a great agricultural power with a banana republic. Agricultural power means to be a banana republic. Now, I think that we are no longer in Prebisch times when there were these terms of trade so unfavorable to commodity producers and so favorable to industrial producers. You can be now a commodity producer that have a lot of power. If you, for example, control some minerals, now all the world is in your hands. So being an agricultural power doesn't in itself mean much. What means a lot is what you mentioned, that just 3 US multinationals control the grain production. And this agricultural production does not promote, Hirschman again, forward or backward linkage. So transport industry, transformation industry, food industries are not developed together with this. It's not agricultural production in itself, nor it is to be a provider of the semi-finished goods. This is the road that was followed by Poland, by the oriental periphery of Germany, and Czech Republic, Poland. They became providers of semi-finished goods to Germany. But now, after this initial stage, I think they can move to another stage, less control by the center, to use your terminology. Last observation, I am really worried by what you told us about the war has not in the least decreased the power of a neoliberal ideology, because that would be an extraordinary case. All previous cases I studied of war economists, included World War II, see a relax of the creed in the power of the markets in favor of a more socially oriented and controlled economies. If this is not happening in Ukraine, this means that the situation is really serious, and this is something that certainly does not cheer me and the other people up.
Thank you. So, Guglielmo, please.
Thank you. Now, if next year, in what will surely be very contested, open and fair elections in Russia, Putin manages to win a further mandate, by the end of that term, he will have matched Joseph Stalin's time as leader of Russia. Wasn't Russia at the time of Stalin, but you know what I mean. So it will have changed. It will be a long period. It will have changed the geopolitical picture of Europe. And bar any shock that we can't foresee in the next 4 or 5 years, Russia will have emerged into something which was not in 1999. That is a pole of attraction, both ideologically and economically and militarily. Not as big as the Soviet Union, but still much more than it was expected in the 90s. For this reason, I think the considerations which have been made today, the presentation, were all very, very useful, because they all put Russia and Ukraine in a global perspective, which is essential in order not to just limit ourselves into the historical, local, cultural legacies. I think that is by now, let's say, accepted that we need a global perspective to understand that part of the world. I think even from others' perspective, the recent book by Jaroslav Hrycak on global the history of Ukraine is called Global History of Ukraine. We need to put Ukraine in a global perspective. So, commenting on, in particular, what I'll start with what Andrey said, who made the biggest effort into understanding globally the political economy of Ukraine. There are two questions. Will Ukraine be a semi-periphery or a total periphery? Let's say, will be forgotten or will be used somehow in a dependent way? And will it be a periphery or semi-periphery of the West or of the East? Or which part of Ukraine will be a periphery of which of the two poles of attraction? In this, Andrey doesn't say anything about the Donbass. It doesn't. Well, you mentioned the Donbass, but you don't mention how important the economy of Donbass is in the picture, which I think is maybe a topic of discussion, is my first question. Is Donbass sufficiently important to shift whoever gets Donbass, or most of Donbass, into a semi-periphery rather than periphery, because Donbass is more productive than the rest, or maybe not? I perfectly agree with what Annalisa said about agriculture. That is the fact, Argentina, Brazil, and so on. And anyway, all trends show that agriculture is becoming more important. So it's not, it's being an agriculture-focused country doesn't mean you are a banana republic, or in this case, maybe a beetroot republic. I don't know which name we should use for Ukraine. What is interesting, though, is, where the sources of investment will be. If Ukraine is an extreme case of transition crisis, something that in other countries have experienced, but it didn't it was deep, it was serious, but it was a few years. Here we have 3 decades of transition crisis and hardly come out of it. So if there's been such a depletion of productive power, is where investment will come back. I mean, assuming the Soviet Union is not coming back, where it will be from. That's the big second question, and this links to what Volodymyr presented very interestingly on the two Ukraine, the East-West. All the overlapping between the language divide, the regional divide, and the class divide. And I tend to agree with him. The class divide would be more important. It's hidden by the other ones. And I think the evidence of what happens, especially among the Russian speakers in East Ukraine, is very, very strong. That is, we see people who are, they may vote here for one party or the other, may have their preference, but really what they prefer is the sectors where the living come from to be protected. And if it is protected by Russia, it's okay. If it is protected by the EU, okay, it can also be fine. That's very interesting. That's a very important point. It also raises an issue about what will happen if Ukrainians integrate in the European Union, which the Council has decided today whether officially the steps are going further. Because if this would mean, we are in Florence, so let's mention, it sounds to me like an Italian saying which is attributed, the historian will correct me, I don't think it was said by them, by Florentine Francesco Guicciardini in the 16th century, Francio Spagna, porque se magna. There is a France or Spain, so long as we eat. It sounds like Ukraine is a bit, at least the east of Ukraine, is a bit Guicciardinian in that sense. But if that is true, what we already see a little bit in the other countries which have joined the European Union, a purely instrumental approach to being part of the European Union works, but also creates instability. Because as soon as the money doesn't arrive, or as soon as the balance of transfer changes, it creates a huge amount of possible tension. To Volodymyr, I would ask, if it is, I find his presentation very convincing on the east side. I'm not sure, as you said, it's not symmetrical. I don't think it perfectly fit the West. So let's make an experiment. I'm not a historian, so I'm allowed to invent counterfactual because political scientists do. Let's not invent a counterfactual which is completely absurd, but it's a thought experiment. That Zelensky was elected in 2019, this is true. In 2019, it wasn't very clear where it was going. It was voted by both sides. And for some reason, instead of listening to the Galicians, he listens to the Russian speakers and decides to make a big deal, to do a Yanukovych, make a big deal with Russia, to stop trade with the European Union, to pass a law that makes Russian compulsory in all schools and Ukrainian only in the afternoon for 2 hours, and things like that. And then a coalition of willings in the West, led by Poland or some other country, decide to intervene militarily to protect the rights of the repressed minority in Galicia and to protect the economic interests which are being destroyed by this point. Let's assume that happens. I think the reaction of the population will be very different from what we've seen in the East. I don't know, because so this is a question. But I would expect that the Ukrainian speakers in the West to mobilize and welcome, let's say, whatever Polish willing army would have arrived much more than the Russian speakers did in the Eastern Ukraine. And I would have probably expected also maybe the Russian speakers to react differently. So probably it's still not completely symmetrical. This is, although I would agree that the class dimension is more important, this is absolutely visible in the East. I'm not 100% sure it is so visible in the West. And that is, I think, is a big question, because let's assume the West to Ukraine at some stage will be integrated somehow, where even Putin admits the West Ukraine, that there is no, it's unredeemable, they will never be friendly with the Russians, we'll give them away. So what will happen to them is particularly interesting, I think, for Europe. And the final point I want to comment, because I think it's very visible it's very important and very striking in Andrey's presentation, in a way it affects them all, is the demography. I mean, the demographic crisis is so big, and it's a bit in the whole region. In the Baltics, the Baltics lost more population within the European Union than under Stalin. It's Poland. The reason why the election went a certain way is because also the demographic fall has been so fast. But one aspect of the demographic fall happening so fast, it can be even fastened by the fact that, I don't know whether all women who left Ukraine last year or two, they will go back to Ukraine, who knows. The longer they stay out, the less likely it is they will ever go back. Is that it is true that many, especially Russia, but maybe also the European Union in the future, will promise not so much to Ukraine, will promise stagnation and stability. For a society which is aging so fast, stagnation is fantastically attractive. Fantastic. It's the most attractive thing you can get, is stagnation. We see it in Italy. This country is in love with stagnation, doesn't want anything to change. And Italy is aging very fast. Ukraine is aging even faster. I think if I were a politician in Ukraine, I would say, I promise you a lot of stagnation. And be careful, I'll protect you how it is, nothing will change. And that will be quite popular, because young people are not there anymore. And people who are not that young, they don't want too much turmoil. So these were my questions. I think it was very, very exciting, very good to have you all here. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's 4 p.m. I think we should take at least some minutes more for the responses of the speakers, and then we possibly leave more room for debate in the second part of the conference. Okay? So let's ask who wants to start from the speakers. Alexander.
Let me think what together, what to ask anybody of the participants. Maybe you, because you domestic Ukrainian moods better than anybody else here in the audience. Is it, any condition ready to make peace against the territorial concession? Because it's a very painful question. It may be not put by me as a speaker. But when you see Russian sociology, you see that, 50-60% of the respondents are in favor of the peace. When you dive a little bit in depth, you see that what they understand by peace is not basically what is understood by peace by the international community, because they somehow combine the idea of peace now, right now, pace subito, here, but combine this idea with the idea of that anything that we have seized should remain with us. Explaining it with not very logical way, basically, which for the Ukrainian side leaves two options: to continue fighting or to stop fighting with what we have now. And to stop fighting, again, with two possibilities: to stop it de facto or to go further for some sort of agreement, which will mean exactly the last point of my said remarks, that somehow the aggressor will be rewarded. What the Ukrainians, who are the only one to decide about this, may think or thinking now about this, well, two basic choices.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Guglielmo, for the questions. That's actually very, very interesting and interconnected questions, and maybe even start from Alexander. That's because that's indeed a very interesting story. When I mean, the latest poll that we've got about the Russian moods, that the Russian field poll, that they found that almost like 48 or basically almost the half of the Russians, they finally prefer peace to the continuation of the so-called special military operation. But when we look at the other question, they prefer peace on the terms of Russian victory. So yeah, they prefer peace by the victory of the Russian army, which is like very rational, very logical. But then it's a fundamental question for those people who are engaged in the discussion of peace and war. Are we seriously thinking about this in terms of democracy? So these are going to be kind of like referendum or what? Why exactly are we concerned about the outcomes of the service, and also considering all the reliability issues that are existing in Russia and in Ukraine, which are different, but still affect dramatically what we get and think about the moods in Ukraine. So are we going to have like a referendum on peace and war? Unlikely. So those things are going to be discussed on the elite level, on the level of the perhaps even closed negotiations first. Then maybe that they would go public and so on and so forth. So this discussion about the polls and what Ukrainians or Russians think about the conditions of the peace are not exactly politically rooted into, so what? If, let's say, 80 or 90% of Ukrainians are thinking that, no, we are not going to leave Crimea back to Russia. Does it mean that Ukraine is going to fight against Russia for Crimea until the popular moods are going to change? No. So, and this brings all to the point of my whole argument. It's not exactly the moods that matter either in Russian or in Ukrainian politics as well, whatever both countries are claiming to be about themselves as democracies. Almost like the majority of the countries in the world claim to be democracies, and they appeal to the will of the people. But it's not necessarily that the polls or even referenda or even like properly conducted elections are the most decisive factor in the politics. But the capacity to influence the politics, the capacity for mobilization, the capacity for violence in the politics, and we are seeing that the politics are becoming like more destabilized, that the conventional practices are replaced by more unconventional practices, by the capacity to mobilize, by the capacity to threaten with violence, and that would be the question about your counterfactual. We are not even need to think about Zelensky, but that was the situation of Yanukovych in 2014. What if he decided to suppress Maidan with tanks, with machine guns, and just to create a bloodbath in Kyiv in February 2014 to go until the end? Or on February 22, he was speaking to the Congress of the regional elites from East and South in Kharkov, And there was a real question whether those regions are going to not to stand with Yanukovych, not recognize Euromaidan, and then it would lead to the civil war in Ukraine. So that was also the question for Zelensky about the Minsk Accords, so whether this would lead to some internal destabilization, not to the fantasy scenarios about Poland invading Galicia, but to what is he going to do with that nationalist minority, right? And the question about stagnation, it's actually the question about the starting point for stagnation. Italy is much richer than Ukraine. And so Italian pensioners can reach on much higher levels of life than Ukrainian pensioners, who were typically overwhelmingly also voting for the president who promised some stability, but the starting points are too different, I would say, and that's really, really important.
Okay, thank you. Andrey?
Well, thank you.
2 minutes, please. Yes.
The first, about Annalisa question. About what is the main sources of Ukrainian backwardness? I think, yes, of course. Soviet breakdown has great influence on development. Degradation of Ukrainian economy. But the main cause, I think, that it was neoliberal market reforms. Why? When Western capitalism developed its industrial base, it overcomes all market spontaneous fluctuations of prices, fluctuations of crisis, by developing large socialized character of production, and created huge, initially trust, cartels, then concerns, great corporation. Now we have core at cutting-edge economy, cluster of huge corporations, financial industrial groups. This is very socialized character of production. This is integrated type of property. Not disintegrated as in Ukraine and in most peripheral countries. Character of property and production. They seriously change the target functions of production. If private capitalist property has as main goal of only private profit, the target function of this vertically integrated economy has as its target functions value added, not only profit, but in waste. So it interested in demand. This is a great difference between Western economies and peripheral economies such as Ukraine. Then about Donbass. I remember very old banner published in 1992, before Donbass became Ukrainian. Donbass is industrial heart core of Russia. And of course, after Donbass was included in Ukraine, it was the industrial core of Ukraine and the whole Soviet Union. And it is after 2014 when Ukraine became loose industrial enterprises, metallurgy and others in Donbass. It became change the structure of export of Ukraine. The share of metallurgy lessened, but the export of grain, of food production, of agricultural production rose. And without Donbass, Ukraine transformed the bread basket only. Well, in periphery or semi-periphery. The matter is that the world system analysis give not their criteria for distinction. But in general case, is characterized by concentration of labor-intensive, material-intensive production. Contrast to the developed countries with knowledge-intensive, capital-intensive production. By these criteria, economy Ukraine plummet in periphery. General periphery or semi-periphery, this is integral characteristic. But many political factors. For example, the capability of state sovereign position. Spain lose its capacity.
Thanks, and we'll start the second different course. First, Oleg Zuralev, now like Scuola Normale, previously like got his PhD from the European University Institute, Political Radicalization and Social Change in Contemporary Russia. Oleg?
Yes. Now? Okay. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and thanks to all the organizers for attention to our research project. So I will present different research projects I, with my colleagues, conducted during last 10 years. And I would like to claim a rather provocative thesis and to look at Putin as a counter or just a revolutionary. And you can see the questions I would like to answer. So how Putin's regime has been changing in reaction to radicalization of civil society and social movements in Russia during last 10 years. And then how after the war started, Putin tried to promote fundamental social change within the Russian society in order to create the new stable order from the chaos of the warfare. So, and I will rely on hundreds of in-depth interviews with protest participants in Russia, with ordinary Russians who passively support the war against Ukraine, focus groups, ethnography, and also opinion poll numbers. So I will briefly repeat what I have been talking last time during the last conference. So if we look at the Russian society, we can see the dramatic political change which started in 2011. So before 2011, Russian society was interpreted as a political society characterized by political passivity of the general population. But in 2011, we can see the unexpected huge protests for fair elections against electoral fraud during the elections into the federal parliament. And this big event created the new democratic politics. So we see dozens of new civil society groups which emerged out of this big protest in 2011, 2012. And this new civil society turned out to be much more radical and protest than civil society before the big protest. So it was local activist groups, civil society groups that solved small problems, resolved small deeds, but with a new political meaning, opposing Putin's regime. Then we see the rise of Alexei Navalny movement, which is a kind of populist, both right-wing and left-wing populist movement, which was very radically anti-Putin. So the goal of the Navalny movement was to change the regime, and the Navalny movement was becoming much and much larger and radical during last 10 years. Then we saw the emergence of municipal deputies movement, which again was aimed at solving concrete problems in the local areas of Russian cities, but also combined this practice with political anti-Putin agenda. And then we also see the radicalization of politics, not in Russia itself, but in other post-Soviet countries, which Putin always considered to be his sphere of influence. The revolution in Georgia, the revolution in Armenia, the revolution in Ukraine in 2014, the failed revolution in Belarus, and the huge political crisis in Kazakhstan just before the war. So, as I already wrote and argued many times, the specificity of this new democratic politics was a lack of positive agenda and emphasis on delegitimization of the Putin's regime. So the new civil society movements effectively created the image of the Putin's regime is anti-popular, is illegitimate. And it was very successful. So now let's look at the Putin state. So how it was created. In the 1998, Russia experienced huge economic crisis. And this crisis led to big devaluation of ruble. And it became very profitable for big business to export, not just to steal post-Soviet property or make money from insider rent. And big business in Russia realized that it needed the strong state to create new rules of the game for big business. And Putin became the representative of big business who created these new rules of the game. But how he did it? He excluded big capitalists from the politics, because before Putin's era, oligarchs and big businessmen influenced Kremlin a lot. So Putin still served in their economic interest, but he excluded these persons from decision-making process. So that is why, I consider, together with my colleagues, Putin's state is Bonapartist. Also, Putin was aimed at depoliticization of masses, and he somehow neutralized the civil conflict between the poor and the rich, between nationalists and communists on the one hand and liberals on the other, which lasted during all 1990s. So, in a sense, he excluded popular groups as well as big business from politics. And that is why we, together with Volodya, Ishchenko, we consider Russia as one of the examples of hegemony crisis. So post-Soviet rulers cannot become leaders of the society, cannot propose economic and political future for social groups. And even if they are popular, they don't have organic ties with social groups. So they are isolated from civil societies and from the society at large. If we look back at how the Putin's regime itself changed during last 20 years, we will see that Putin's regime was becoming much more militarized, radical, conservative. And this radicalization of the conservative agenda, of authoritarianism, happened within the same time period within which social movement and civil society radicalizations happened in Russia. So, in a sense, we can say that radicalization of Putin's conservative state happened in reaction to radicalization of the civil society and social movements in Russia. It was like very contingent process. So even if Putin himself believes that he lives in like stable world of struggle between Russia and the West, which lasted for centuries, in reality, it was very contingent, very eventful interplay between the civil society and the state, reactions and counter-reaction, politicization and counter-politicization. And thank you very much, Lorenzo, for your articles you sent me, like including your own about Brigada Rossa. And it is also important that dissolution of the Cold War order, which represented a rather stable system, it was not just substituted by more chaotic and contingent temporal order. The very destruction of this order facilitated the contingency. It added more contingency in terms of temporality into the political dynamics in post-Soviet countries, including Russia. So, okay, Putin was frightened and radicalized by not only international political crisis, international struggle, but also by the social movement radicalization and by the revolutions. Then he started the war against Ukraine to somehow suppress this radicalization of the civil society, to prevent radicalization of society at large. And he, after the war started, also in a very experimental mode, is now trying to, as I already said, create a stable order from the house of the war. So our last several months, together with Volodymyr and with our co-author Ilya Matveyev, political economist from Berkeley, we studied military Keynesianism, the new macroeconomic policies orchestrated by Putin and his allies, which through deficient spending create new jobs, 2 minutes, okay, create new social groups who benefit from the war. And also, Putin tries to create new ideology. And our interviews and focus group, they show that it works, but not very well. So we made focus groups with people from military-industrial complex. What they say, that okay, now we have stability, this is very good, but still we don't feel like very good in economic terms, so we are not happy. So they complain a lot about some economic problems, but still they rely on this new order. So they somehow feel stable with this order. Ideology. So Putin cannot impose his imperialistic ideology on population. Population don't buy it. But systematic analysis of interviews I conducted show that very many people who were very critical towards the war in the beginning now started believing that like war was inevitable. And if it is inevitable, the Russian army is better to win. So even if they are not imperialist, they start believing in something new, in inevitability of the war and of the struggle between Russia and the West as a fact, as a matter of fact. So, and I will finish now with a very important idea. The new book by Ellinson, which just was published about how Arab authoritarian regimes reacted to the Arab Spring. He analyzes this in terms of counter-revolution. And Putin seems to be a counter-revolutionary politician, but he does not just reverse the achievements of revolution, because there are no achievements of the revolution, because he prevented the revolutions in Russia to be successful. But what is also important is that he tries to create new orders through economic measures, through demographic reforms, and through ideological measures. And so we are accustomed, and we know from Tony Negri, from Andreas Kalivas, many other theoreticians, that what is called constituent power, which is opposed to constituted power, is what belongs to multitudes, to popular movements. But now we see that Putin, who is resisting revolutions and global domination, who tries to create new social and political order from the house of the war, he really looks like a revolutionary who is resisting his enemies and who tries to create new people, new society, new order. And answering the question Donatella asked previous time, like how to define this counter-politicization of the Putin state in reaction to politicization of civil society, I would say like that constituent power is what can explain this regime change. Thank you.
Thanks, Oleg. Now we have Galina Slivanova, Russian society responses to the invasion of Ukraine. Galina Slivanova got her PhD from SNS, now is at the University of Bonn, and we are glad that she's back.
Thank you. I'm also very happy to be back, and thank you for inviting me and surviving for such a long time today at this conference. I'll start my timer. So this is a paper, and I'm at a very initial stage of its development, and I'm very happy to be able to present it today. and get as much as possible feedback from the audience and from my former supervisors, hopefully, who are discussing this paper. So this is a study that I started it a year ago, and then it was lying for rest for some time. So a few things that are now included in the manuscript might sound a bit outdated, but at the same time, it's the way how civil society responses developed over the year. So the puzzle and the whole idea of the paper emerged when I've been asked several times what is happening to Russian civil society, what are the responses, and Chiara and I, we even presented in Stockholm together our thoughts at the very early stages of the war on how civil society was under pressure and how civil society responses emerged when the war started. So I decided to think a bit further about a theoretical framework that can be applied and can help us to explain how the society responds to the pressure that was effectively eradicating any sort of resistance in Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. And when we talk about civil society, and here this classical fourfold definition of components that we include in civil society and we study either separately or intertwined, include public sphere, associational life, meaning organizations, NGOs, civil society, social movement organizations or social movements, culture of civic culture, and finally citizens' engagement. And then I stumbled on a concept of activated citizenship suggested by Francesco Cavatorta, I think his last name is Cavatorta for sure. And he studied authoritarian civil societies based in authoritarian countries of the Middle East. And he suggested that activated citizenship is a good concept that can describe how society responds to pressure when it is impossible to rely on associational life, when associational life is being systematically eradicated from and cannot be active, so NGOs cannot be active anymore. And at the same time, this concept recognizes that authoritarian systems, they differ from democratic system or hybrid systems, and probably cannot be measured in the same way, and societal responses cannot be measured in the same way we think of them when we study democracies or hybrid regimes. So in a sense, this activated citizenship concept is linked to citizens' engagement, but it also, the focal point of this concept is individual responses. It's not related to citizens' engagement through organizations or through associational life. Rather, citizens respond to social pressure or to certain circumstances, policies, through their own ideas and own strategies. So I took this concept of activated citizenship and started applying it to the Russian civil society and how it responds to the war. And then thinking of mobilization trajectories and responses trajectories, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is Hirschman's classical threefold definition of exit, voice, and loyalty. How customers or how citizens respond when they are not satisfied with policies or not satisfied with what state is doing, with what authorities are doing. And certainly there are alternative ways of looking at that. For example, when Chinese civil society organizations are started, some scholars conclude that they shadow state, so they do not follow this threefold definition, but create their own responses. So that's why I also decided to create, following Hirschman's approach, I decided to look at and have my own definitions of responses. And this is how, sorry. Yeah, I will come to it in a minute. This is how the threefold definition was developed. I do not want to stop on this slide for a very long time because Oleg has presented very, very well what was happening between civil society and state in before the war. But I would like to stress a few things that I think they were not very relevant in Oleg's presentation, but are very relevant for my presentation. So first of all, before the war, civil society space was closing very, very gradually. I very much like this metaphor of boiling frog. So the frog of civil society in Russia was boiled in a very, very slow motion, and sometimes we couldn't even notice how civil society got suffocated by state policies. Then, very importantly, the state has developed a very nuanced approach to how different segments of civil society were approached. So, for example, protest and contentious politics was violently suppressed, and those organizations who were giving some social services, some welfare services, they were even encouraged by the state. Certainly cutting off international support and funding by foreign agents law, everyone knows that, but also parallel creation of facade civil society, so-called gongos, it was also a very important strategy of the state. And certainly informational campaign. As we know, Russia used to be an informational autocracy. This is very good concept coined by Guriev and Treisman. So all these characteristic features were valid for Russian civil society before the war started, and then war as a critical juncture certainly changed a lot, and oppression, it became less gradual, it became crushing repression on civil society, and associational life together with protests, with contention, was eliminated from the public, from the civil society space. It was shrunk almost immediately. We all know that lots of independent media outlets had to relocate. Civil society activists were kicked out of Russia. So this all happened almost instantaneously. Right. Yeah, so violent turn, destruction of associational life, and mobilization along lines of conservative ideology. This is how political context changed for civil society when the full-scale invasion has started. So I suggest that Russian citizens, active citizens, activated citizens respond along three lines. First of all, they could choose, they tried to choose voice. Voice was suppressed, so they chose silent resistance. Then, on the other hand, allowed obedience and exit or even escape. I'd rather call it escape rather than exit. So let me explain what I mean by these three types. So strategies along the lines of silent resistance include, for example, open letters and petitions, which is a classical form of strategies, one of classical strategies that existed in Soviet Union and is now even more actively used by Russian civil society or by Russian activated citizens. At the beginning of the war, we saw many different petitions from different professional groups that demanded to stop the war or express their concern. It was framed, it was worded very differently, but the idea was more or less the same. Then we have a provision of assistance to the refugees, to the Ukrainian refugees, first of all, from occupied territories, which is done, and those who provide this help, you can immediately, when you talk to them, you can immediately understand what is their stand on the war, what is their position, what they think, even if they do not talk about either their for the war or against, for the special military operation or against the war. The way one can understand about their political preferences is what escape routes they offer to Ukrainian refugees. Those who try to send Ukrainian refugees outside of Russia, ship them effectively to Europe, they are often opposing Putin's regime and used to be active in some other civil society organizations very often, like election monitoring. Those who try to help Ukrainian refugees, but at the same time suggest to stay in Russia, they are often those who largely support the war or special military operation. So in this sense, the silent resistance, it exists, but at the same time, we know that civil society can be, is not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it can be an empty signifier and amplify those cultures, those policies that state suggests. And this is very well seen in this strategy of assisting to the Ukrainian refugees. And another strategy of silent resistance or showing discontent with the war policy is included in the third type, the anti-war art. And speaking to activists in Russia and also those who left Russia, I always get this as an example of Russia's resistance to the war. And when I asked why this is such an important sign, one activist explained that this is a sign that we are not alone, that a person who is against the war and she or he sees the anti-war art on walls of the city, they understand that there are more people who think the same way. So this is the way to show our unity even when we are dispersed. Then there are a few more, I do not have much time, I'll be very brief. And so there are two more things that are emerging right now, and I was not sure how to classify it, so for now I put it into the silent resistance, although this resistance stopped being that silent. So first of all, the female face of resistance. At the early stages of the war, that was feminist anti-war resistance. This is how it is in English. And most of them relocated. I have it. I know. So most of them relocated outside of Russia to Europe. But now there are another protest of wives and relatives, female relatives of those who were mobilized to go to the front. They are also becoming more and more active and more vocal in their protest against injustices of this war mobilization. And another thing is related to the radicalization of protest. And we know that in Russia, protest was usually not violent. Violence during protests was usually associated with the police violence rather than violence of protesters. Currently, we observe this development related to arsons, to explosions, to such things that were never characteristic feature of Russian protest. Right, this is about silent resistance, and other two things are very short. The loud obedience is related to administrative mobilization that has to actively and vocally demonstrate support to the war. Then support and donations for army that are that are collected not only by administrative forces, but also by volunteers actively, and supports to refugees from Donbass and Luhansk. For example, as I mentioned previously. And for example, there are lots of online groups in social media that suggest help, but only to refugees from these occupied territories, and they are very, very strict about whom they're supporting and why they're doing that, because they support the special military operation. And as I mentioned, this loud obedience is now turning into discontent. There's protest against unlimited mobilization, which is a very recent development. And the final is exit or escape. So I prefer to call it an escape because a lot of people had to move, had to leave Russia, the most active part of urban Russian population. And we see the huge wave of development of new media outlets that are based abroad. There are even more of them that used to be in Russia, so strong informational campaign. and then also emergence of new organizations and initiatives abroad. And there can be the whole research program on purely on these new organizations, because it's a very interesting constellation of different diasporic organizations who used to be abroad for many, many years, and a wave of new groups, new initiatives that come from Russia, bring their own culture, bring their own grievances, and try to incorporate them to local European or non-European political context. In general, they realize strategies like lobbying and advocacy, rallies, and some day-to-day activism, again, help to refugees, help to Ukrainian refugees or Russian refugees. Last slide, I promise. So these are very preliminary conclusions. I'm still thinking of how to develop this project further. I think that activated citizenship and strategies of activated citizenship describe fairly well how Russian society responded to this major crisis, this critical juncture, if you want. So results of this activation are yet to be seen. I think one of the positive side, it is harder to repress single citizens who only draw, I don't know, some anti-military painting on the wall, rather than repress the whole organization. So this dispersion might be beneficial for civil society. And then as one scholar who used this notion of activated citizenship studying Vietnam suggested that citizen-led activism rather than associational-led activism is an emerging form of civic engagement, and it might play a very important, very critical role in reshaping state-society relations, but this is, again, yet to be seen. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Galina. Now we have Maria Chiara Franceschelli, who is close to defend her thesis somehow, or writing up. Nowadays she's visiting in Berlin, but she's from the Scuola Normale, and she will provide a presentation titled Human Rights Groups and the Rebuilding of Russian Civil Society in Wartime. So, Maria Chiara, the floor is yours. 15 minutes, please.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Well, maybe like a bit louder.
Okay, I will scream. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lorenzo, for your very optimistic perspective. Yeah, I'm very sad not to be there with you today, but I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present a study that I am currently conducting together with Professor Vyacheslav Morozov, who I think that is also connected today. So hi, Slava. So we are conducting the study on Russian human rights group and the rebuilding of Russian civil society in wartime. And we are based on the case study of OVD-Info, which is the most prominent human rights groups in Russia. As I said, our study is still ongoing. So today we will present our empirics so far and connect them with our theoretical framework. So as my colleagues have already showed very efficiently, Russian human rights group never had it easy. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has only made matters worse, sparking an unprecedented wave of internal repression and forcing many activists to emigrate. Russian dissident society has been able neither to prevent full-scale invasion and war, nor to protect long-lasting mass mobilization against the war. Yet, not has it been entirely passive. Instead, it has tried to resist using the means available under the circumstances, showing adaptive skills and resourcefulness, as we have seen. So our works look at the case of OVD-Info. Our goal is to identify the key lesson that can be drawn from the experience of OVD-Info about the capacity of Russian civil society to resist and react. We describe OVD-Info, how OVD-Info has made sense of and adapted to this new reality and assess its potential for democratic innovation under these circumstances. So our study is based on in-depth expert interviews with board members of OVD-Info and media monitoring of the group. So first of all, what does OVD-Info do? In the understanding of its leading figures, the activities of the organization can be broken down into two main goals. The first goal is to help political prosecutees very pragmatically and concretely, which means to provide timely help to political prosecutees, round-the-clock on-site legal assistance to detainees in courts, in prison, and detention centers with hotline, with telegram bots, and other remote strategies, as well as collecting large-scale data on political repression in Russia. This is only possible thanks to a vast network of more than 5,000 volunteers all around the country, including lawyers and IT experts. The second goal is more forward-looking and more long-term. It aims to spark a systemic change in Russia and to prepare the window of opportunity for regime change. For this goal, OVD-Info puts great effort in educating civil society about opportunities for participation and to encourage the creation of ties like within the society and to involve people into civic action, so adopting a bottom-up approach. Next to this, the group also does a lot of advocacy work in international organization, and thus it integrates a more top-down approach to system change. In 2021, as my colleagues have already introduced, Russia was shaken by a massive wave of protests in support of Alexei Navalny. Detention, arrest, and abuses by law enforcement followed these protests and were widespread, occurring in many places to which OVD-Info had not yet extended its reach. So concurrently, OVD-Info itself faced threats, including being designated as a foreign agent, while the oldest Russian human rights organization, Memorial, was forced to close down. For the organization's activists, who by this point had already a decade of experience of observing cycles of protest and repression, the events of 2021 were a clear signal that the nature of the regime was changing. The Kremlin was intentionally destroying the organizational infrastructure of civil society and mechanism of participation so as to foil any grassroots mobilization against the government. This crisis pushed OVD-Info to increase its operational capacity. So OVD-Info almost tripled its workforce and strove to find lawyers and volunteers in the so-called new areas, so in the areas where it was not present until that moment. And also guided by the principle that no one is irreplaceable, its activists consolidated the strongly horizontal structure of the network in order to avoid disruption in the event that key figures were to be arrested or anyhow become inactive. So if someone is not available to work anymore, this means that the organization will not collapse because of its horizontality. Apart from this, volunteers also went through in-depth training in safety and security, and the organization's capacity for remote data collection was augmented. However, activists also interpreted this repression, so the 2021 watershed, as the sign that something big was about to happen, and that the Kremlin's effort in suppressing civil society were also aimed at annihilating its participation capacity vis-à-vis new dramatic consequences and developments. And unfortunately, as we all know, they were right. So due to the sinister prediction that the Kremlin was thinking of something way more dramatic, when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, OVD-Info was ready to face a new unprecedented peak of internal repression because they had reorganized following the repression peak of 2021. So after February 24, OVD-Info's work has been reorganized along two main principles. The first one is the prefigurative one. So post-war Russia and its civil society must be transformed in line with the rule of law. And this future transformation can only be driven by a proactive, resilient, and organized civil society, which must therefore be built today. Further change can only be sparked by direct action in the present and in day-to-day activities, which is what the volunteers do, the lawyers and the IT specialists and everybody who is involved in the day-to-day activities of OVD-Info. And the second principle is the preventive one. So the war must end and no such war must occur again. And long-term suppression of human rights in Russia and the degradation of the state's accountability to its society have tended to produce external aggression. Therefore, respect for human rights must be prioritized as a means to ensure global security in the future. So ensuring global security through the preservation of human rights and the preservation of a healthier, so to say, internal policy. And following these two principles, Infos wartime activism has focused on three main strategies, which of course frequently overlap. So the first one relates to networking processes. So increasing the project capacity required achieving a new level of grassroots diffusion. So the anti-mobilization revolt in several republics in the North Caucasus in September 2022, following the launch of a new military mobilization, highlighted a gap in the Info network, meaning that Info hadn't reached yet those regions. So in response, the group intensified their effort to reach out to regional activists and independent journalists from those regions, and to provide news about protests through their own media outlets. The goal was to give voice to less prominent groups and to attract activists from new areas. Info also helps Russian grassroots civil society organizations scale up. The main problem that grassroots organizations face in Russia, in fact, is lack of resources. They have been long cut off from foreign funding, as Galina was saying before. So Info, over the year, has accumulated significant resources, and it has decided to share these resources with less experienced colleagues. So how? Info often lends its volunteer workforce to other organizations to carry out specific tasks like data management, digital development, graphic design, social media management, and so on, but also on-site volunteer work. This process of insources other organizations' work by loaning them volunteers enabled these organizations to grow without building hierarchical top-down structures, so they can grow without being somehow subject to a larger organization. And lastly, Info also shares know-how and resources with other civil society organizations in a similar manner to what I have just described. So it conducts training courses for the staff of other civil society organizations. It teaches them how to coordinate volunteer work and how to use efficiently digital resources, how to develop and provide services such as bots and hotlines, and how to deal with legal issues. And it's Info also share their data sets on political prosecution. So anyone can access data set on political repression in Russia just by going on their website. And it encourages researchers and journalists to work with these data. So lastly, I would like to conclude by connecting our preliminary findings, so what I have just presented, to our theoretical framework. So we observed that our interviewees stressed a processual and relationist and interactionist understanding of Info's role in the Russian authoritarian context. So they underlined the importance of state-civil society relation as a litmus test for a regime's future trajectory, also in other fields, such as foreign policy. But also the growth of Info is the result of the intertwinement of the organization and the state, which can't be separated in the observation of Info's trajectory. So this perspective also stresses the crucial role of civil society as a deterrent for the state's aggressive policies, which is one of the main objectives of Info. Info also adopts a prefigurative temporality, so which means that it anticipates the change that it wants to see in the future by engaging in direct social action to ensure compliance with the rule of law, and by bringing their political action into day-to-day life and activities. Lastly, in terms of democratic innovation under an authoritarian context, the case of Info can provide a significant contribution to the branch of social movement studies that focuses on democratic innovation and contribution beyond the institutional milieu, such as in terms of mobilization and social capital. The case of Info also contradicts the perception of Russian civil society as dead and buried, as it had sparked a successful and broad engagement. And as a very last point, we would also like to stress that the case of Info and its resilience offer a very efficient formula for civil society action and engagement under authoritarianism. So I will conclude here. Thank you very much. Feel free to reach out if you have any suggestions or questions. And I want to point out that all the pictures that I've used in this presentation are from the Info website. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Maria Chiara. Now we have, as discussants, Donatella Della Porta from Scuola Normale Superiore, and then Francesco Strazzari from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna. So Donatella, if you want to start.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you to Oleg, to Galina, and to Chiara. It seems to me that the research on the issues is advancing our knowledge, but also maybe related also with some potential opening for resistance. I've learned a lot on issues of grievances and the regime reactions, on the type of strategies that the groups that you have been studying have used, and on the issues of some organizational formats. What I want to do in this, I assume 5-6 minutes, is
not more.
to connect these issues with some more mainstream social movement studies agenda, and to start with a citation by Sidney Tarro in this important book on social movements and war. He wrote, "While the state imposes increasing taxes, the army suffers defeats, and the corps of soldiers come back from the front, enthusiasm for wars declines. The movements develop against the growing cost, but also the reductions of rights that happen almost always when states enter in a war," which apparently is not the case in this moment in Russia. But what I wanted to reflect upon is if on the basis of this citation, we can also reflect on the more general characteristics at three levels: the level of the grievances, the level of the availability of resources that Chiara touched upon, and the level of the availability of resources, but also the type of opportunities or missing opportunities. So these three elements. So in terms of the grievances, just connecting the papers, it seems that what emerges especially from Oleg's presentation is a vision of quite reduced costs. So the costs that Sidney Tarro had expected in general to come out from wars do not seem to be, do not seem to characterize the Russian situations now, because what Oleg has mentioned in the presentations and in the papers is that the sanctions were mainly a failures, and also in the first part of this afternoon conferences emerged that the economic costs, there are some, but are not as evident as in other wars. And what about soldiers? What about relatives from soldiers? Because this is an element which has barely being addressed, the human costs of these wars, which are in Russia not felt in terms of bombings or civilian victims, but there is this unknown areas of the human cost in terms of soldiers' life, and the type of lack of mobilizations of relatives and so on that I don't know, probably in part is also related with exit strategies, but it is also something I think that would be relevant to address. Then in terms of resources, all the three of you have addressed some types of organizational strategies that have been used in the past, very heavily repressed, but also I wonder if readings of the presentations could also be in terms of resilience of some type of networks, and at the same time the type of other interventions of other movements. So Chiara talked about the more traditional type of oppositional civil society organizations that also Galina has studied in the past, and Galina has introduced the different strategies at the individual and collective level. I'm wondering to which extent the type of other movements that, for instance, Chiara is studying, like the movement mobilizing in the periphery on locally unwanted land uses, or feminist movements, transnational type of campaigns are also part of the pictures, or if they're missing, why. And finally, in your presentations, there was a very often reference to repression. I wanted to connect also a bit with the first part of this conference in thinking in terms of two questions. Which type of war is this that to a certain extent challenges Sidney Taro's expectations about reactions to wars? So how can we define the challenges in terms of the specific characteristics of this war at home? In the case of the Vietnam War, there was also costs that were especially related with the lives of the soldiers. And this represented the main conflicts. In the Russian case, it is less clear, and this connects also with my previous reflections on the ways in which existing cost in terms of human life can produce mobilizations. And then something that has been discussed in the first part of this presentation is related with the type of political regimes. That is something that Oleg insisted upon in the first part of the conference. There was the reference to a regime of oligarchs, but also at the capacity of Putin to intervene in mobilizing nationalist discourses. And so maybe some reflections and connections between the Russian type of opportunities and constraints, the opportunities that are limited and the threats that are many, could also help understand another dimensions that Volodya and Oleg have insisted upon, and this the class dimensions of the unequal cost distributions of the war. In general, I was also thinking maybe for a next conference, what would be also interesting is to reflect upon different international characteristics. On the one hand, the fact that often movements developed through connections between those mobilizing against the war in the countries which is on the aggressive side, but also connections with the activists of the other country. And if we see the dynamic of the Ukrainian-Palestinian conflict, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we find is also mobilizations on the side of the Jews, on the side of the civil society in Israel, and attempt to construct interethnic sort of oppositions. Here, it is something that we don't see.
Remember the 5 minutes, Donatella.
Sorry?
Remember the 5 minutes.
Yes, it's not something that is visible yet, and I think there is also a lot of tensions, but it would be interesting also to address this type of elements and the elements of two other elements, but I say just in a second, of the international dimensions. One is the one we were discussing with Chiara yesterday, the diaspora. So activities outside, it dovetails somehow with what Galina was saying, but also the dimensions of international type of campaigns that seems to have a very different dynamics in this conflict and in the Israelo-Palestinian one. But thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Donatella. Now we have Francesco Strazzari.
Yes, I guess it was when Putin announced the way we saw today is running again, that he made a statement which drew my attention. He said, mentioning the Ukrainian side, they're running out of ammunitions, and they have no ideology backing their cause. And that they have no ideology, I find it interesting, because it signals, if you want to look at a bit the way, let's say, the ideational dimension is constructed. First of all, that Putin thinks that time is on his side, and the rest is somehow obsolete and shallow. And second, I mean, there is something over there about the fluidity of the scenario in which we are also looking at the way sanctions are, in a rather surprising way, failed to make a difference in the direction everyone was expecting. And there, I'm no economist, but we're discussing that with Marius a while ago. Is it plausible replacing an entire class of engineers, educated technicians, and so on, many abroad, with Iranian, North Korean skills? Is that something sustainable over time? What does it say about the leading edge of technologies, the competitive side that contributes to drone industry and everything that backs the war effort? I'm not sure about that, but I think this is something that should interrogate also the societal level, not just as well as understanding what is the role of labor. But I don't want to go in that direction. I want to go back to the ideology side, because if there's something we understood in the last few days about on the Ukrainian, on the Zelensky side, I mean, we've seen Zelensky touring Europe, going to meeting with Orban, talking to Macron, ending up with Milei. New questions about the Singapore model, whether that plays a role somehow. And somewhere, the New York Times today is announcing some possible breakthrough in the question of aid from the US and Europe and Norway and so on, which might somehow compensate and hopefully, from the Western point of view, avoid that 2024 is going to be what was 1916 for the battlefields of World War I. That is the more gruesome year with no advancing in terms of military campaign. So if that is the kind of way this is being debated by the New York Times today, I was wondering how that touches base with what we are discussing today. That is the question of how consent is tangible in terms of how consent is tangible in terms of the situation inside Russia, how fractures are opening inside Ukraine in terms of political elite and what comes now through into the media, and also how that might project a bit in terms of what we understand to be the direction. I think we cannot be completely pessimistic. I mean, I understand that there's a lot of things that are going in a way that is normatively controversial, to say the least. But for instance, if we look at that from a point of view of international relations, and that's where I come from, my angle, we cannot say that Russia gained traction in Central Asia. We cannot say it gained traction in Transcaucasia. We cannot say it gained traction in Eastern Europe. We see a lot of ambivalence, uncertainty. We see a lot of double games. We see Elon Musk, backing first the Azovstal resistance and then drawing that back. The latest is that Elon Musk, after meeting Benjamin Netanyahu, is going to meet Giorgia Meloni at Azeglio. This is the latest that the Italian newspapers are announcing. So we see a lot of reshuffling of ideas, which makes it difficult ideologically. But if we go down to the fundamentals, it is possible that the rebounding, the way in which Russia has been able to maneuver through the dire situation expected out of sanctions is not structural. I mean, I want to raise it as a question at least. I mean, can we really think that, of course, Russia has a strong productive capacity. We are not talking about an experiment in the world of sanction like any that we have seen before. But can we really think that if we go across the corner of the American election in 2024, what we see in terms of fundamentals of relationship between society, ideology, and structural element in terms of class relations and so on, is there to stay beyond 1 year? Or is some breathing space that in a rather, through tactical adjustment, Russia proved able to do, both in the battlefield by adjusting to the surprise of an utter failure in the first few months, and in terms of domestic economy, plus in terms of arranging a kind of bricolage ideology, which we tend to call conservative, but I think we can call it reactionary, because there's a lot of reaction in terms of historical. So my question is a bit that, whether what we observe with some grim sense today is something that we can plausibly see as a trend. A trend that goes into the deep future, or whether it's something that somehow has the flavor of tactical expediency, and in this kind of confused ideological moment allows some breathing space, hoping that the fragility of democracies opens, formidable ways for the regime to prosper. Thanks.
Thanks, Francesco. I think we can also open to collect some further questions and comments so that we have the time also to hear from the audience their thoughts, and then we will provide back the opportunity to answer. So we have Manuela, Mario. Go ahead.
Okay. 30 seconds. So from macro context and international relations and to again the meso level and civil society and organizational interactions within civil society vis-a-vis the war. My focus, as you know, is always on far right. And so I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit more, if you can, also online. What do you think about the interaction between the context of war and civil society far-right groups in Russia? Because, of course, this war did empower, did disempower several different types of civil society actors. And we know that it did empower far-right groups on the one hand, but also it did provoke also division and split within far-right groups. this not only in Russia but also in Europe. And this is also partly linked to the one point that also Donatella was mentioning concerning the resistance and transnational resistance. We also know that far-right groups around Europe are connecting even more to far-right groups in Russia, also against the background of this war. So I would like to ask you a reflection on that, if you want.
Thank you very much for this problematic but very interesting discussion. I would like to start from Donatella's question. What type of war is this? I think we have to understand this war, the Ukraine-Russia war, as one of the model of the new wars typical after the Balkan Wars, where these wars are founded on nationalism, are wars against a part of society with a lot of civilian victims, and are wars which consolidate, are part of state building in some parts of context. So in this sense, we understand why this war has had some but limited opposition in domestic civil society, and had was an engine of consensus to some extent in some social groups, with further division on nationalist lines. And in this sense, the second point is that I understood why Alexander's book on ending dictatorship in Spain, Portugal, and Greece was relevant in this context, because clearly the case of understanding why authoritarian states have a different nature in their relationship with civil society, not just in terms of repression, but in terms of the perverse logic and of the difficulty of shaking up. In the case of Southern European fascist dictatorship, we also had a hopeless 30-year period until the end of the 70s. And the end of the 70s were a period of decolonization and therefore, and of course of progress in European dynamics, and which made it impossible to maintain this type of fascist regimes. So there are two elements. There is always an external force that shakes up an appearance of hopeless stability and persistence of an authoritarian system, and also at the same time the construction with a very long-term patient work of domestic oppositional forces. In this sense, it seems to me that what has been discussed in terms of what is happening in society is still a very preliminary factor. So I am happy that Maria Chiara is rather positive and enthusiastic about these experiences, but clearly this is the first step of possibility of rebuilding civil society activism. If you think what was happening in the case of South European fascist regimes, you had political parties, international connections, a much stronger network aiming at regime change, not just as protection of human rights, which of course is important, but is a very basic step. Finally, on the military, on the economic side, clearly there is another story, which is apartheid South Africa. Apartheid South Africa was strengthened in commas by sanctions because it was able to build the domestic economy and the industrial capabilities of waging wars. So in the short term, it is reasonable that the Russian economy, in a context of high oil prices, is able to have the resources also at the international level to build its arms industry. And at the same time, the Ukraine economy is basically a war economy to a very large extent, and the only prospect proposed by Germany is to make the Ukraine the center of war production, of arms production for Europe as a whole, which is a terrible prospect as well. So, but again, this is a sort of short-term perspective. There is a a short-term possibility of satisfying domestic constituencies, providing jobs and providing limited growth, as long as nothing happens. Imagine a situation where oil price collapse, and of course, Putin will have very short possibilities of continuing along this road. So in this sense, it's very interesting because we have all learned a lot of interesting dimensions that have to be combined together. But also one fundamental lesson we have to learn is that there is no military solution to conflicts. And this is also an illusion that Europe and the US have been playing with. So there is no way to win military any war, and in particular this war, and the complexity of these dynamics have to push us to look for a more complicated way of addressing political issues with political means. Thank you.
There is a further question, comment from Cesar.
Yeah, my question probably is for the three presenters. Thinking about, history shows us that a key actor mobilizing and opposing authoritarian regimes is the student movement. We have seen several examples of opposition movements of opposition starting from universities. In, for example, Nicaragua or also in Venezuela, in the Arab Spring, there is evidence of the significant roles of universities. Universities as a space of autonomy that allows civil society force to develop autonomously from the state, no? So I was wondering, what's the role of universities in the Russian context today? And probably the general question would be, is there any particularity of the Russian case that prevents the emergence of this kind of opposition? I'm also thinking in comparative terms with China, no? The last relevant student movement in China took place 30 years ago, in 1991, no? So I was wondering if there is a resemblance there too.
Okay, then I think we have collected enough comments and questions. You address what you prefer in your answer, and we start from Galina. Is it okay?
Sure. Does it work? Yes. Okay, very, very briefly. What type of war it is? I don't like it, but I think the best way to frame it is a colonial war. And I really doubt that it is a new type of war. The new type of war the new aspect of the war is probably the fact that it is very well documented, much better than other previous wars. But I do not think that Russia, at least Russia, is conducting any new type of war. But I'm not a military expert for sure. Then quickly on the ideology, and I think I can blend this question on ideology and question on far right, because in my opinion, Russian state figures have expropriated, they adopted the far right terminology and this conservative narrative very, very well, and they exploit this narrative very well. And those groups that become even more far right and more critical, they are also sanctioned and they also become oppressed. And it is amazing to see how the state oppresses these people who were very unpleasant, but they were very, very vocal in supporting the war, in saying that there should be even more war, that they were criticizing Putin from the side that he is conducting a wrong type of war, that we should bomb everything from Donetsk up to Lviv and then probably even Warsaw. So everything should be eradicated and eliminated. So these guys are being similarly oppressed, and sometimes they're very frustrated and surprised that they are also being oppressed as much as supporters of Navalny or other pro-democratic movements. Yeah, what was another connections with abroad? I think at least what I briefly observed is at the first stage, at least at the very initial stage of the war, far right in Europe, they were somehow distancing from Putin and from his war. They were trying to cut ties. They were trying to eliminate any sort of connections and try to put some sort of distance. Whether it is increasing now, I'm not sure, but at least this whole narrative, the conservative narrative, it is pretty universal, I think, what is Putin saying, what is the state actors in Russia saying, and it echoes. And speaking to, I do not talk very often to AfD supporters in Germany, but sometimes our paths cross in a curious ways. And what they say is that, of course, Putin's what is Putin doing is terrible, but this is a reaction. This is not this is a provoked reaction to what people were doing in Europe to cause the war, and Russia is only Russia is effectively a victim in this sense. And then I will jump to the question of Cesar about universities. I do not think that universities in Russia are a space of much autonomy, to be honest. Maybe, again, I do not study academic freedom in Russia, but from my experience studying in Russia and also teaching there, this might be related to the fact that social sciences and politics are very badly taught in Russia still, and in the quality of discussion, the quality of teaching and literature and materials are very, very low. So students, they're not being indoctrinated, they're not being taught any sort of resistance strategies, any I don't know, freedoms, whatever you call it. So personally, I do not see universities as a center of autonomy in Russia much. Maybe in big urban centers like Moscow, St. Petersburg, this can be the case, but at the same time, the state worked very, very hard to push out all scientists, all scholars who were opposing to the regime and who were vocally opposing the regime outside of the universities and outside of Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Galina. Maria Chiara, do you want to join in?
Yes, thank you. Very, very briefly, some points have already been touched by Galina, so I will not develop on that. One thing about the last question that I always point out, and that I think also emerged today when we ask ourselves, how did we come to this situation, is that this didn't start in 2022, this didn't start in 2014. One could say that it started in the 2000s when Putin was elected for the first time, but also somehow also even earlier from the USSR, but also the fall of the wall and the fall of the USSR and the Yeltsin period. That there never was a consolidation or like a building or like an emergence of democratic infrastructure and infrastructure of participations, of democratic participation that could actually ensure the emergence of a democratic system in Russia. And this erosion of operating space for civil society has dates to very, very long time ago. And then we have peaks, and the peaks can also have these predicting functions. But there was no U-turn in a way. There was no somehow a change in the trend. There was no a redirection. It was all very gradual. And I think that this is something that we also have to keep in mind. And I mean, for sure, I don't want to be somehow misled or misunderstood into thinking and to make people think that movements by over the info, even though they have a huge operational capacity, and I think this is something that from a strategic point of view, we have to observe very carefully, because in a way they survived this long-standing erosion, 20 years long, 30 years long erosion of operating space for civil society, we don't have to be tricked into thinking that they can single-handedly change the situation. In my slides, there was this quote that said that from one person in the board of AVD-Info that said, okay, when the right time will come, when we have a window of opportunity, and this is this is a sentence that they use, and it was not like me putting some social movement studies term into their mouth, but when a window of opportunities come, we will jump in. But we will jump in with the things that we have created so far. And it's true that there are no relationship with other important actors in societal change, like parties and like economic actors, although there were. Before February 24, AVD-Info had built ties and alliances with institutional actors. The problem is that after February 24, that kind of cooperation was no longer considered as possible. There was no space for that, but they have somehow built like this space that, hey, if an institution decided that they want to operate by our principle and that we have some kind of shared vision, there is space for that and we will support that. Yeah, so I think that this is also something important. Like, no one is expecting here a revolution, but if there is some kind of conjunction of planets that we can jump into, then we will be ready. This is more or less it, and I think that it's something that we need to take in mind. And one very, very tiny point, although I don't think that I am among the three people that have presented in the last panel, I don't think that I'm the one to tell, because we have exponent of the Russian diaspora also among us. But I would refrain also to consider Russian, I mean, we tend to speak about Russian civil society in exile, but I would refrain from considering Russian civil society outside of Russia and Russian civil society inside of Russia as completely non-communicating, completely separate. This is not true. It can be true for several parts and groups in civil society, of course, but this also happens within civil society in one country, in one polity. So this is nothing weird. But I think that we should also keep in mind that it's fluid than the periphrases Russian civil society in exile might suggest, and that there are still opportunities also in this regard. There will be maybe we could go on for 3 hours, but I don't think that's a good idea. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Chiara. Oleg, your turn.
Thank you very much. First, would like to answer to Donatella's comments. So if we consider terror theory, by the way, the first element, grievances, is very present in our interviews and focus groups with people somehow touched upon by the war. So, but this is not political grievances, this is moral grievances. So people, like every day, complain about many aspects of the war, economic, social, political, but this is very specific discursive genre of moral complaint, which is hard to translate into political critique, and no one knows how to do so. About the soldiers, this is interesting. So we could interview people who have friends, and also we could, in our ethnographic fieldwork, our volunteers could observe the soldiers. So, and even within their own discourse, they present themselves as both victims and beneficiaries of the war. Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, general Russian population was never recruited to the war. So in Chechnya, in war with Georgia, professional soldiers took part. So now we have the mobilization, and it is very new experience which creates this status of victims. But at the same time, Russian military volunteers and soldiers never maybe even saw such big money they now get from the state for the taking part in the war. So it's maybe 10 times more than they usually get in their civic jobs. And even if we look at how people communicate with each other, we always see this like, okay, you get like relative of a soldier, you get some money, but you lost your husband. What is more important? So they discuss it every day. Which type of war is this? It is very interesting because many Marxists consider this war to be imperialistic war, but we have to ask ourselves, so what kind of imperialism it is? In our economic study, we see that before 2014, so before the war in Donbass, Russian political leadership helped Russian big business to buy Eastern Ukrainian assets, factories, for example. After 2014, and after the full-scale invasion, pro-Russian separatists and Russian army itself destroyed the very factories with the rockets it used to try to buying before 2014. So this military imperialism is not just a continuation of economic expansion before 2014. At the same time, the interesting thing is that Putin himself considers this war not imperialistic, but nationalistic. He avoids usually to call the war a war. But for example, today, he stated like, we are at the war of national liberation. And he tries to create this image of war of national liberation. But even in objective terms, so what Russia is doing, it is not occupying totally new territories. These territories are perceived to be lost in the dissolution of the USSR, lost by Russia. So the relationship between imperialism and nationalism in this war is something to be solved in future for by the researchers. And Francesca, I just briefly would like to say that, so we don't know whether Putin had some long-term strategy and long-term ideology before the war. But why I compare him to revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, because he combines somehow structural adjustments to tactical adjustments to new unexpected reality of the warfare with some tendencies that already existed. For example, in our research of military Keynesianism, we show that Keynesian measures existed already like 3-4 years before the war in Ministry of Finance documents. So they were going to implement, to try to implement. And the new reality of the war forced them to do it quickly and to do it radically. The ideology, okay, we don't know. So Putin is a very Western person, like he likes to go to Germany, to Sky, and he like and like LGBT homosexual people, for example, are overrepresented in Russian parliament and in and they are very, very Western lifestyleistic people. But at the same time, there are conservatives in the Russian elite. There are a Russian Orthodox Church. There is a kind of conservative civil society. Putin relied also on this part of the elite and civil society. And now what he needs is to create new kind of stability and to make Russia different from the West. So, and he tries to develop any kind of ideology. So any ideology which will make Russia contrast to the West, maybe will helpful. About the far-right movements, I'm not an expert, but what is important to understand, so I consider the regime change, the regime evolution is as evolution from repressive authoritarianism to counter-revolutionary regime. And within the first stage, the Russian state really suppressed the far-right activists and leaders. So almost all of them who could mobilize the streets turned out to be in prison. But during the second stage, when Putin himself became a kind of radical nationalist, he substituted them, in a sense, with his state. But also, from our research of the war in Donbass, which started in 2014, we could see that old Russian nationalists, for example, leaders of RNA, Russian National Unity, very famous far-right movement from 1990s, they took part in some dirty business of, for example, transporting the weapons to the anti-Kiev separatists. So in this not repressive but counter-revolutionary phase, so his state somehow tried to engage these people into the hybrid war in Donbass. And two last points. I agree with what you, Marius, said about the war, but I would like to stress that, yes, this war is war against the part of the society he wants to exclude. And he tries to consolidate the part of the state, but not just consolidate. Why, again, I compare him to a revolutionary? Because he tried to recreate the type of capitalism, the type of capitalists around him with military Keynesianism. And he also tries to recreate social groups with this new economic policy to reshape social boundaries and to create popular support. So he fears to rely on existing social groups because it is too dangerous. But if he will reshape them, maybe it will not be so dangerous for him. So it is like a revolutionary tactic because of fear of relying on existing social groups. And by the way, Donatella, about nationalism and class distribution, it is interesting that, still open question for us, but it is interesting that people, our interviewees who benefited from the war, so they somehow welcome nationalist ideology as justification of the war. So they say like, we are well-to-do, we have a family, we have a job, and we defend our family and our country in this war. So they somehow make these connections between nationalist ideology and their well-being during the war. And the last question about Cesar's question about the university. So in Russia, during the new liberal reforms, we had another kind of autonomy of deans and administrators from professors and from students, because some universities survived because of lack of money after the Soviet Union collapse. Other universities understood they can make money because it guarantees the access to job. But yes, so if we compare, for example, university movements with trade unions of industrial workers in Russia, we will see that industrial workers are organized much better than the university workers and students. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I ask the previous speaker if you have something to add. I am curious about Alexander's book on the parallels with the Spanish, Portuguese, and the Greek dictatorship. How do you want to expand a little bit on these forms of resistance to authoritarianism? And I also ask Volodymyr and Andrey if they want to add something. There is a microphone somewhere.
I just make a small correction about the soldiers fighting in Chechen wars, because they were recruit soldiers, so conscription soldiers at masses. What was not the case, the soldiers on payment, they were not paid, and the economic background was really unprecedentedly strong in this particular war. No previous war of the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet Russia, I'm not going farther in the Romanovs empire, the money didn't play such an important role in a war effort. It's unprecedented, really. We have to think about this. We have to analyze this more properly. And this is counterbalancing many negative effects, and partly explain the lack of protest, not just repressions, but as well the redistribution, as I put it in the previous session, of money. Then, in comparing with old, not that old dictatorships of the European South, yes, we are seeing some similarities. Strongly personalist character of both regimes, when the personality of the leader is the main institution of the regime. It encompasses somehow all possible check and balances. And remember how Putin 2 days ago announced his candidacy. He repeated twice during this short, not even speech, but responding a couple of questions, that he had doubts, he had different considerations, which is a show, of course, a typical authoritarian show, that it somehow it was intended to calm the audience. I understand that I'm doing something that maybe is not typical in a normal political system, but I'm available. I'm aware of it. So he was showing that he encompasses in his figure all possible checks and balances that in a normal political system are distributed over the society. It's exactly like, the figure of Franco was not only the political institution #1, but was like an Adam in paradise, was encompassing all possible institutions as his personality. He was a prime minister, he was a head of ruling movement, he was sort of regent in a vacant throne, and et cetera, et cetera. We are on the stage now, and when crossing the constitutional threshold, we receive another similarity, a long life rule. Both Franco and Salazar were ruling. We are now complaining that Putin is too long in power, like 23 years, with not to forget the exclusion of 4 Medvedev's years, so in fact less than 23. But the other guys were in power for 40 years. So we are going in a totally different environment now. We a long life ruler we haven't had since the Soviet time. The other similarity is this combination of reactionary revolution, which you mentioned, and I mentioned in my intervention, as like war as a anti-globalist uprising, anti-modernist uprising. The modernity is too bad. Let's turn into the past, which is brilliant, which is glorious, which is almost perfect, and let's restore this past. But because the evil powers of modernity are against this brilliant past, we have to fight to restore this past. So this counter-revolution presented, packed as a revolution, or vice versa, like nationalist revolution in Franco time. The difference is that both in Portugal and Spain, before the dictatorships, we had somehow longer parliamentary traditions, which is very important for the future democratization. Because when we see the cases of successful democratization of long autocracies, they are basically re-democratization. It's much easier to democratize Spain or Japan or Germany because of this long period of parliamentary monarchy or parliamentary rule of parliamentary republic than Iraq, let's say, had no such experience. So Russia is something in between. Had a tradition, a period of political freedom, but it was very short.
History matters very much. Volodymyr, do you want to add something?
How much time do we have? Because Oleg is also raising a hand.
I think we have to go
Maybe
we can continue over dinner then, perhaps.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just finish it.
Okay, we continue our conversation over dinner. Thank you very much indeed, because this was a very, very profound understanding of the complexity of this issue. Thank you, Donatella and Maria Chiara in Berlin, I think. And we will continue this line of research with in 2024 with a new appointment, and we are very glad that we can continue to consolidate some original perspective on this complexity and tragic situation. Thank you, Francesco. Thank you, everyone. And let's think also on how we can leave some trace of this debate and perhaps think of publications that can include this collective effort. Thank you very much.